The morning the Kestrel River disappeared, the county learned the most expensive lesson drought can teach. The river did not fade into a trickle. It ended. By 9 o'clock the gauging rocks stood bare in the sun. By noon the town pumps at Dry Creek were sucking air. And by evening, across nearly 40 miles of pale basin and cattle country, there was only one real sheet of open water left. It lay in a white field on Ada Mercer's ranch. Not in the river bottom, not behind a concrete dam, not at the end of $1 million well. In a 3-acre reservoir cut into the one patch of ground every expert in the county had marked as worthless. People had a name for that field. The White Quarter. People had a name for the reservoir too. Ada's mistake. 5 years earlier, when the basin was still green enough to hide its fear, the county's best water minds told everyone to drill deeper, automate harder, and stop wasting time on dead land. Ada Mercer stood up in the back of a crowded meeting hall and said she was going to dig a reservoir into that dead land instead. They laughed at her. What happened next was not magic. It was not luck. And it was not a story about old wisdom defeating science. It was a story about one kind of knowledge looking only at the skin of the ground, while another kind had spent a century studying the structure underneath. Ada Mercer was 71 in the spring of 2026. She had the kind of face the high desert makes on purpose, wind-burnished, marrowed by light, lined by weather, and calm in a way that unsettled hurried people. She lived on the same spread her family had worked since 1909, where the sage began to thin into alkali and the soil could shift from black loam to white crust in 100 steps. Her ranch did not look modern enough to impress anyone from an office. That was one of its strengths. She ran 90 cow-calf pairs, 2 hay meadows, a modest bean field, a kitchen garden, and a windbreak orchard of old apricot trees that survived mostly because she refused to let any one part of the place carry all the burden. Her late husband had once said Ada didn't farm products, she farmed margins, small redundancies, backup plans. Things that kept a hard year from becoming a fatal one. The first official warning arrived in the mail on heavy county paper. Drought Preparedness Summit, Dry Creek Grange Hall, attendance strongly encouraged. 200 people showed up. Ranchers, hay growers, county men, irrigation suppliers, bank officers, and every family in the basin with a loan tied to rain. At the front stood Reed Holloway, from the Regional Water Authority. He was 39, precise, well-spoken, and dressed like the future had already chosen him. Behind him, a projector washed the wall in clean blue slides. Reservoir deficits, snowpack anomalies, evaporation forecasts, recharge models, aquifer diagrams. The whole room leaned forward. Reed told them the old cycle of relying on spring runoff was over. The basin was hotter. The winds were harsher. Surface water was unreliable. The answer, he said, was below them. The Crowell Aquifer, a deep sandstone reserve almost 600 feet down. State subsidies would cover part of the drilling. Low-interest loans would help farmers install telemetry pivots and precision moisture systems. The message was powerful because it sounded measurable, professional, controlled. You could buy your way out of uncertainty. Then Reed put up a color map of the basin. Green for prime ground. Yellow for usable. Red for land the models considered structurally inefficient. He circled a bright white-red parcel near the northern edge of Mercer's ranch. This quarter section here, he said, is a classic alkali flat. Surface salinity, hard pan crust, poor infiltration, weak organic profile. Under our drought strategy, land like this should be retired or grazed lightly, not developed. Any attempt to hold surface water here would be a high-loss decision. A few men nodded before he even finished. Everybody knew the White Quarter. Nothing but brittle grass, salt bloom, and shallow standing water after storms that vanished almost as fast as it came. From the back of the room, a chair leg scraped wood. Ada Mercer stood up. "That's my field," she said. Reed gave the polite half-smile of a man who expected resistance and had data ready for it. Mrs. Mercer, this isn't a criticism of your operation. I'm just telling you what the Basin report shows. Ada looked at the map, then at Reed, then at the men already deciding she was about to argue with math. I'm not retiring it, she said. I'm cutting a reservoir there. The room broke into startled laughter. Boone Halver, who ran the neighboring cattle outfit and had known Ada for 40 years, barked loud enough for everybody to hear. In that salt patch, what are you planning to store in it? Moonlight. More laughter. Reed kept smiling, but there was condescension in it now. With respect, that's the worst place on your ranch to put open water. The evaporation load would be brutal, and the surface won't hold. You'd spend real money to make an expensive mud hole. Ada did not raise her voice. She never needed to. You're reading the crust, she said. I'm reading the bowl under it. That killed the laughter. But only because nobody understood what she meant. Her granddaughter, Tess Mercer, sat 3 rows ahead with her cap in her hands and heat burning across her cheeks. She had come home after 2 years of studying agricultural systems in Boise. Everything Reed was saying sounded current, actionable, bankable. Her grandmother, standing in the back and talking about a bowl under the field, sounded to Tess like the exact kind of stubborn local legend modern farming was supposed to outgrow. Asked, and what exactly is this bowl based on? Ada answered, a century of holes in the ground. Then she sat down. The meeting ended in a line of sign-up sheets and fresh confidence. Families clustered around Reed. Drilling contractors handed out cards. A representative from the bank talked monthly payment structures. An irrigation dealer booked site visits before the folding chairs were even stacked. Within 6 months, 17 new deep wells were under contract in the basin. By winter, there would be 24. Ada signed none of it. Instead, she emptied a savings account, sold a trailer she rarely used, and hired a scraper crew with an old Caterpillar and a younger operator named Luis, who thought the whole job sounded insane. On the first Monday in May, the machinery crawled onto the White Quarter. For years, that field had looked like a wound from a distance, pale and hard under the sun. Up close, it was worse. The top crust cracked like fired pottery. Salt dust clung to boots. Even the sparse weeds looked discouraged. Luis dropped the blade and shaved the first pass. The crust came up in hard white sheets. Behind him rose a smell like dry minerals and old earth. Tess watched from the fence line, arms crossed. Pickup trucks slowed on the county road. People grinned. A few leaned out windows to ask if Ada was building a marina. Ada ignored all of it because the White Quarter was not a bad field to her. It was a note nobody else could read. The note lived in a ledger wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom drawer of her kitchen cabinet. Not a formal survey. Not a scientific report. A family book. In 1912, Ada's grandmother, Nora Mercer, had spent one savage spring resetting fence posts, repairing a collapsed windmill footing, and hand-digging a washout trench after a cloudburst cut across the north side of the ranch. In the margins of that ledger, between calf weights and seed counts, Nora recorded what each hole revealed. Red grit, loose sand, broken caliche, blue gumbo, sticky gray clay that swelled when wet and sealed like crockery. On the White Quarter, those notes became unusually detailed. Under the bitter crust, Nora wrote, there is a clay cup, not a layer. A cup. She drew it too. A shallow basin of bentonite-like clay beginning below the alkali cap and deepening toward the center of the field. A relic, Ada believed, of an ancient cut-off channel that had filled, sealed, and slept for generations under the salt. Nora Mercer had found it one post hole at a time. She had not possessed the money or machinery to expose it, but she had left behind something Reed Holloway's map did not have. Depth memory. Ada paced the field before every cut, using old measurements translated from fence lines, the remains of a buried stone marker, and the angle of an old wash, no longer visible unless you looked for it at dawn. She was not digging a random pit. She was stripping the skin off a buried container. For 3 days, the scraper only broke crust and hardpan. Lewis shook his head and spat white dust. On the 4th day, 10 feet down near the center mark, the color changed. The blade peeled up a dense blue-gray material that looked almost oily in the shade. Lewis killed the engine, jumped down, and drove his boot heel into it. The clay gave, slowly, not loose, not crumbly, tight. He cut a block out with his shovel and tossed it to Ada. It hit her palm with a damp weight no one expected in that field. "Well," Lewis said, "I'll be damned." From then on, even the digging changed tone. The crew stopped laughing. Ada had them widen instead of deepen too fast. She wanted sloped shoulders for runoff capture, a protected center, and a north berm high enough to break the prevailing summer wind. She had Lewis cut the basin like a crescent, because the natural depression beneath the field bent that way, and because straight lines are often the first sign a human has stopped listening. By the end of 2 weeks, the white quarter held a raw blue basin 2.5 acres across, and 24 feet deep in the center. It looked ugly, industrial, exposed, a wound inside a wound. And then the sky refused to help. The summer of 2026 turned hot and empty. The famous late June storms dissolved north of the basin. The first water that gathered in Ada's new reservoir came from one crooked thunderstorm and a few trickles of sheet runoff. For a week, the bottom held a shallow brown pool. Then the sun tightened on it. By August, it had shrunk to a nasty-looking patch of mud, no wider than a horse corral. The jokes came roaring back. Ada's mistake, Mercer's bathtub, the desert dock. Tess heard all of it. And worse, Reed's plan seemed to be working. The new wells hit water. Cold, clean, pressurized water. Fresh pivots through glittering circles over fields that should have been fading. The men who had borrowed hardest now looked smartest. Their hay stood thick. Their cattle stayed fat. Their dashboards told them exactly when to irrigate and how much. At the coffee counter in Dry Creek, people spoke Reed Holloway's name the way frightened people speak the name of a competent surgeon. Ada's reservoir, meanwhile, looked like proof that old instinct had finally become expensive stubbornness. That fall, Tess confronted her on the berm, while the mud below them cracked into blue-black scales. "We could still stop," Tess said. "We could fill this in, drill while the state money's there, and salvage the west meadow." Ada was cutting willow stakes with a hatchet. She didn't stop. "You don't build a reserve for the year things are easy," she said. Tess kicked at the salt-whitened edge. "It's barely holding a puddle." Ada pointed with the hatchet. "Look lower." Tess climbed down and crouched near the center where a little water still clung in the shadows. The surface was ugly, but underneath, the clay was slick and dark. The moisture had stayed where it touched the blue bowl. It had not vanished into the field. "It's holding," Ada said. "Just not enough yet." That winter, they planted the berm and margins the way Nora Mercer had once described stock tanks in dry country. Willow stakes on the windward rim, Baltic rush and hardstem bulrush in the shallows. Native sedges where runoff would arrive first. Tess thought it looked pathetic, sticking green cuttings into a place everybody else regarded as a failed hole. Ada called it finishing the container. Year 2 began with less snow and more wind. The kestrel ran thin by April. County restrictions came early. Families using surface diversion got cut first. The well owners did not panic. Why would they? Their pumps still worked. Ada's reservoir held a little more each storm. 1/2 an acre by June. Maybe 4 feet at the deepest point. Still too small for anyone to call success. But no longer laughable enough to dismiss in a single glance. Dragonflies found it. Then red-winged blackbirds. Then one morning, Tess stepped outside before sunrise and heard frogs in a field that had not hosted frogs in living memory. It should have felt triumphant. It didn't, because every look over the fence told a harsher story. The Deepwell men were still winning. Their circles stayed green while everyone else's ground went bronze. Yes, the power bills were climbing. Yes, Some pumps ran hot. But yields were strong, bank notes got paid, and certainty still seemed to belong to the drilled hole and the steel pipe. That was the darkest part of it. Not the ridicule, not the labor, not even the cost. The darkest part was how reasonable Ada seemed to everyone who had ignored her. Reed's model had money behind it, institution behind it, graphs, software, success you could photograph from the air. Ada had an old ledger, a weird field, and a reservoir full of maybe. By the third summer, maybe started to separate. The basin received a pair of lean winters and 2 mean spring storms that would have been forgotten everywhere else. On most ground, the water ran off fast or flashed away. In Ada's cut basin, each event stayed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. The reservoir widened to nearly an acre. Then more. The willows took hold. Their shade reduced the punishing edge of the wind. The reed fringe thickened. Fine suspended silt settled instead of blowing away. The air over the water stayed cooler at dusk than the field around it. The place stopped behaving like an exposed pond and started behaving like a small system. At almost the same moment, the wells began to show their true price. First came the electric bills, then overheated motors, then impellers chewed by fine sand, then the calls no one wanted to make to contractors who were booked 6 weeks out because the same problem was striking half the basin at once. Borrowed on the promise of endless groundwater, now learned the ugly mathematics of depth. Every added foot of drawdown made everything costlier. Every mechanical failure landed on top of debt that had been justified by the fantasy of reliable supply. Reed Holloway's office stopped using the phrase long-term resilience. They started saying emergency management, then adaptive constraints, then nothing at all that sounded like certainty. Tess changed, slowly, and then all at once. One afternoon, she went with Boone Hauver's son to pull a well pump on their south parcel. The steel came up scored and hissing with sand. The water that followed was cloudy and thin. The man running the hoist looked sick before he ever saw the repair bill. That night, Tess climbed the berm at Ada's reservoir and stood there until dark. The water below held the last light in the basin. A pair of ducks crossed it like the place had always existed. "You knew," Tess said quietly. Ada shook her head. "I knew the field better than the report did." "That's not the same thing?" "No," Ada said. "Knowing is exact. Guessing right once is still guessing." Tess thought about that for a long time. By 2029, the basin had entered the kind of drought that stops sounding seasonal and starts sounding biblical. The Kestrel no longer flooded. It merely arrived. Then one winter, it barely arrived at all. Half the deep wells had been modified once and were straining again. A county geologist, brought in after enough failures made blame unavoidable, found what Reed's original program had missed. The Crowell was not one great rechargeable ocean of water. It was a broken sequence of confined pockets and old deposits with miserably slow recharge. The basin had been mining stored water, not living on annual income. That discovery came too late to save the loans. For sale signs appeared on roads that had carried one family name for generations. Men stopped boasting in town. They started avoiding eye contact. A basin can lose money quietly. What it cannot hide is the sound of faith leaving. Ada's ranch was not thriving. Her hay yields were down by nearly half. She sold off calves earlier than she wanted. The apricot trees set thin fruit. She watched every gallon in the old shallow domestic well. Nothing about her strategy made her comfortable. It made her harder to kill. And the reservoir kept growing. By the spring of 2030, it held close to 3 acres of water, deep enough in the center to stay blue even under a white noon sky. The reeds along the margins broke the wind. The willows cast narrow strips of shade. Deer tracks ringed the mud. Herons began to visit. For the first time in years, life approached the white quarter instead of avoiding it. Still, Ada refused to pump from it for crop irrigation. That decision made even sympathetic people crazy. Boone Halver rode over one evening and stared at the water as if anger might lower it. "You could save a hay cutting with that," he said. Ada stood beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "And then what? And then you'd have feed. For one season." Boone looked at her sharply. "What good is a reservoir if you won't use it?" Ada answered, "I am using it. I'm storing time." He didn't understand, not fully. But he stopped arguing after that. Then came the summer of 2031. The heat settled early and stayed violent. For 26 straight days, the basin sat above 103 degrees. Stock tanks turned metallic hot by noon. Creek edges crusted, the sky whitened. Even the wind felt processed, as though all softness had been burned out of it before it touched the ground. On August 3rd, a section of the Kestrel failed upstream. Not a dam, not a levee, the flow itself. By August 7th, dry stones showed at the crossing. By August 9th, the river was broken into isolated pools. On August 10th, the town of Dry Creek put out a water advisory. On August 11th, the advisory turned to rationing. On August 12th, just after lunch, the municipal pumps began drawing air. Word travels differently when everybody has been dreading the same sentence for years. No one needed a press conference. By late afternoon, the basin knew. The river is gone. The town is dry. The wells are done. And the only real water left is at Ada Mercer's place. Tess saw the dust first. A line of pickups, stock trailers, nurse tanks, and flatbeds moving down the county road in the heat shimmer. She thought, for one honest, terrified second, that they were coming to take it. Ada came out onto the porch, wiping grease from her hands. She had been servicing the transfer pump in silence all morning, as if some part of her had expected this convoy before anyone called. The trucks stopped at the gate. Engines clicked as they cooled, cattle load from trailers. Men got out slowly, hats in their hands, boots white with dust. Boone Halver stood at the front. Behind him were families who had laughed in the Grange Hall, families who had drilled wells Reed Holloway approved, families now one bad week from losing bloodlines built over 50 years. And there, near the back, stood Reed himself. No projector. No blue slides. No authority left in his posture. Just a tired man looking at a body of water his maps had told him not to believe in. Nobody spoke at first. Then Boone did. "We were wrong," he said, looking not at the reservoir but at Ada. "My stock's gone by tomorrow without water. So are a lot of others." The heat pressed down on all of them. Tess felt every old joke and every furious evening and every smug forecast gather in her chest at once. A harder person would have enjoyed the moment. A smaller person would have made them kneel for it. Ada looked past Boone to the trailers. The cattle inside were open-mouthed and dull-eyed. At Reed Holloway, who did not try to defend himself. Then she looked at Tess. What Nora Mercer had left in the ledger was not only a map. It was a worldview. A ranch, Nora wrote once, fails long before the books say it does. If it forgets it belongs to a neighborhood of water, wind, and need. Ada stepped off the porch, crossed the yard, lifted the gate latch, and swung it open. That was the climax. Not a speech, not a victory, just iron on hinge. For the next 38 days, a line formed at Ada's gate every morning. Tess managed the clipboard. Ada managed the pump. Families took what they needed for breeding cows, saddle horses, and emergency household storage. No one irrigated crops with it. No one pretended this was abundance. It was triage. With dignity. By the time the first meaningful autumn rain arrived, just over 2 million gallons had been drawn from the White Quarter Reservoir. The water line had dropped. The reeds leaned tired. Mud showed in places that had been submerged all summer. But the basin had not collapsed. Neither had the county. Enough core herds survived to rebuild. Enough families stayed on their land to imagine another year. Enough humility moved through Dry Creek to change the conversation forever. When outside geologists finally remapped the basin with old drilling logs, storm-cut exposures, and ground-penetrating surveys, they confirmed what Nora Mercer's ledger had implied in pencil 119 years earlier. The white quarter sat above a buried clay cup left by an ancient meander, one of several sealed subbasins hidden under the alkali flats. Useless for crops on the surface, perfect for a patient reservoir once the crust was removed and the rim was shaped correctly. Reed Holloway brought the report to Ada himself. He found her and Tess reinforcing the north berm before winter. He held the papers in both hands like something half official and half personal. "We finally mapped it," he said. "The basin under your field. And others like it." Ada read only the first page before handing it to Tess. Reed added, "Your grandmother was right." Ada looked out over the water, then at the white land beyond it. "No," she said. She just kept looking after other people stopped. In the years that followed, the county did not become anti-technology. It became less arrogant. People still used sensors. They still modeled rainfall. They still measured drawdown and repaired pumps and watched forecasts. But they stopped mistaking clean data for complete understanding. New reservoirs were cut into other alkali parcels, not everywhere. Only where the ground truly carried a sealed bowl beneath the crust. Families brought out old notebooks, fence maps, windmill records, and stories that had once sounded quaint and suddenly sounded like field science. They called them Mercer basins at first. Ada hated that. Eventually the county settled on a plainer term. Subsurface catchment reservoirs. A worse name, a better habit. Because the real lesson of the white quarter was never that an old woman outsmarted the future. It was that resilience begins when you stop asking only what the surface appears to be good for, and start asking what hidden structure is already there, waiting for someone patient enough to read it. The basin nearly died because its smartest people optimized the visible system and ignored the buried one. Ada Mercer survived because she treated the land like it had a memory, and when the river failed, that memory held.